Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is the author of a blog on naval warfare called Naval Gazing. If you haven't come across it yet, I really urge you to seek it out because it's absolutely terrific. It's at navalgazing.net and I'll leave a link in the show notes. Anyway, welcome Bean to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I first came across your stuff when I was reading the comments section in Slate Star Codex. And I must admit, when I sort of first saw this big, long piece on battleships, my heart kind of sank. And then I sort of started reading it. I thought, well, actually, this is quite interesting. And then I read a bit more and I thought, wow, this is really good. And since then, I've been seeking out the posts on Scott Alexander's blog. So thank you very much for that. But I guess my first question is, how come you started posting on Slate Star Codex?
I learned about SSC from a friend back when I was in college, 2013-ish, I guess. And I was reading it, I read it for a while, and then Scott posted a link to an article by somebody called War Nerd, who I had run across before. Specifically, the thing I'd run across of his was an article on how all of the carriers are doomed. And I had read it and gone, this is nuts. This guy does not know what he's talking about. He's making... I did not agree with it. And I didn't agree with the one Scott Alexander linked to, which I think was about the F-35, so I started commenting and just kind of hang around. Graduated college, moved to LA, got my degrees in aerospace engineering, got a job out there, and started... the USS Iowa is a now decommissioned battleship out there. I started volunteering as a tour guide there. And one day on SSC, somebody asked about hobbies. I said, I'm a tour guide on a battleship, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon, I'm writing about battleships.
And what kind of reaction do you get on the blog?
Well, I moved from the SSC comments to a separate blog about the same time I moved from LA to Oklahoma, changed jobs, because I couldn't be a tour guide anymore, obviously. Reaction's been great. I like talking about battleships. I've been fascinated by military stuff since I was 10, younger even, and just, I get to talk about it now and people listen instead of being polite and then asking me to stop.
Well, I don't know. It just is absolutely fascinating, and I couldn't believe how interested I was as I just kept going through it and through it all. And I particularly enjoyed, as a British person, I particularly enjoyed your series on the Falklands because it just brought back to me, and it just went through it bit by bit what happened, and it was an absolute pleasure to read. So thank you.
Yeah, that was a very fun series to write, if kind of long.
I mean, it was kind of long, but you broke it up, right? Pretty much. Was it by day you broke it up? I can't remember now. Was it?
I basically just started and just kind of would write until I either hit a stopping point, had finished the thing I was talking about, or I hit my, was like, okay, this is getting to my word limit. I'm going to chop it here. But it seemed to work.
No, it was great. And as I say, it really brought back the memories for me because I was sort of a very young man at the time of the Falklands War, and so it was terrific. So anyway, thank you.
Welcome.
We said we would talk about whether or not carriers are doomed, and it's interesting you sort of mentioned that you had particular views on that going back some time. But before we do that, maybe we could talk about whether battleships are doomed, or more particularly when they came to be doomed. And in that context, a couple of years back I was visiting Kure, which is the port on the Japanese inland sea where the Yamato was built and went out on its last voyage. And so I wondered if you could maybe say a bit about the Yamato, how it was built, a little bit about it, what the Japanese were up to sending it out on that, final voyage.
Sure. The Japanese Navy is interesting in that they were faced with, in a lot of ways, a really, really tough challenge strategically, because they were having to face potentially one or two vastly superior industrial powers. It's kind of funny, for all the complaining that their Navy did about the naval treaties, which put them at 60% of the American and British fleet strengths, that was a really good deal for them. If everybody had been building as a percentage of their economy, they would have been at I want to say it's something like 20% of the American strength. I mean, obviously, it was a lot easier to get funding in Japan, where the Navy basically could bring the government down if it wanted to, than in the US, where the Navy will take what Congress gets and like it. They were faced with having to fight a far superior fleet. So the idea behind the Yamato was to build a ship that was. They knew they couldn't win qualitatively, so they decided to fight quantitatively and build a ship that was superior to anything that could go through the Panama Canal. That was the idea.
Oh,
They
okay.
they took a look at did studies and said, what is the biggest ship the U.S. can build that can go through the Panama Canal? Because at the time that was we had to worry about both oceans, and so at the time that was a major design driver. There was even a series of studies done in the would have been about 1920 at the behest of Congress, saying, okay, you just keep asking for bigger battleships. What's the biggest you can do? Go crazy with the canal locks. Interesting ships, designs. They never obviously got anywhere. But the Japanese said, okay, what's the biggest the Americans build? Let's build something better. And so that was, they were going to build, I believe, 4 were scheduled, and it was Yamato, Musashi, Shinano, and then there was a 4th that was canceled. And Shinano was converted to a carrier while under construction because they suddenly found out that battleships were not actually that important. Interestingly, for all of the accusations of battleship admirals and stuff, the Japanese were far more gun-minded than the Americans or the British were. Yeah, they built these massive ships. The next largest battleships completed, the Iowas, were, I want to say, about 80% of the size. Massive ships. And the basic problem was, technologically, that they just turned out to be white elephants. They were too big, too precious to be risked very often. I think, as far as I can recall, they were only ever really used on 2 operations, and each time they lost one.
But they were more or less bound to lose one on the last operation, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, the last time the plan was, I believe the plan was, because Musashi was sunk during the Lady Gulf operation by air attack, and they thought that the Americans thought that they had managed to drive off the whole force. They hadn't. The result was the Battle of Samar, which was, for my money, the finest moment in the history of the U.S. Navy, and not so good for the Japanese.
So can you just say a little bit about that battle? Because I think I know the one you mean. It's quite bizarre how it proceeded.
Uh, one of the 2 cases in the whole war where where carriers ended up under battleship guns, and it should not have ended the way it did. The Japanese force was 3 battleships, Yamato, Kongo, and Haruna, I believe, at that point, plus about half a dozen heavy cruisers and a bunch of destroyers. They came across an American. They had, for complicated reasons, managed to slip into gun range of the American fleet undetected. When I say the fleet, it was a group called Taffy 3, which was 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and a couple of destroyer escorts. So the whole American force weighed less than Yamato did. Actually, less. And in terms of firepower, their heaviest gun was 5 inches. And they had 2 dozen. So vast imbalance in firepower here. And due to, I almost have to credit divine intervention. The Americans took losses, 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, and an escort carrier, but they beat the Japanese off.
And how many ships are on the Japanese side? Was it the Yamato, did you say, or the Musashi? I'm sorry.
Musashi had already been sunk.
Oh, okay.
The Japanese it was 3 battleships, half a dozen or so heavy cruisers, I think, and screened destroyers and such.
And as I remember reading about it somewhere, was it because the Americans somehow were able to deploy torpedoes from their destroyers?
Yeah, pretty much everybody's destroyers carried torpedoes at the time. That's kind of where the destroyer originates. It was a combination of that, air attacks, both from that group's planes and more from some of the other groups nearby. And these are, pilots who, this group had been intended to support the landings that were going on Leyte Island in the Philippines, for those who don't know. They were not trained in anti-ship strikes. All of the carriers that had the planes and the pilots for that were up north chasing the Japanese carriers. So, no, it was magnificent. We had a volunteer on the Iowa by the name of Bob Despain, who was on one of the ships there. It was the USS Howell, one of the destroyers that got sunk. He said he spent I want to say it was like 3 days swimming before they finally picked him up.
Gosh.
Lovely man. Sadly, he passed away shortly before I left there.
And could the Japanese see what they were up against? Did they realize the targets that they had under their guns, or did they misunderstand what the opportunity was?
Apparently not. Nobody's quite sure. I'm trying to remember. I think the fleet commander ended up committing suicide or something. So, Kurita, I don't remember what happened to him, but I don't think they were able to interview him after the war. So there's always some speculation on this. Best we can tell, now he had, I want to say, like 2 ships shot out from under him on the way in. They lost a couple of cruisers to submarines as well. Best we can tell, he just didn't realize what he was facing. You know, between the fact that you have these ships doing these incredible heroics and just confusion and fog of war, he apparently thought he had stumbled onto a much stronger group and decided to turn back.
And if they would have sunk that, presumably it wouldn't really have affected the course of the war particularly. It was a smallish part of the whole American effort by that stage.
There were 3 escort carrier groups of that size in the area.
Right.
You know, take out one of them, the others are running away. Halsey's going to turn around and come back. There's the battleships that had destroyed the southern pincher of the Japanese attack the previous night at Suriago Strait, which still had a reasonable amount of ammunition. These are the older World War I era battleships. It wouldn't have been... I do sometimes think if it had happened, the battleship as a type would be viewed a lot more positively today.
Right.
You know, as it is, it's really easy to overlook when you're evaluating it as a type how bizarre what happened there was.
So, as usual, I've sort of driven us into a bit of a cul-de-sac, but we were going to talk about what happened to the Yamato. So, what happened to the Yamato?
Okay, so in April of 1945, the U.S. invaded the islands of Okinawa, which is southwest of Japan. It would have been the final stepping stone before the actual invasion of the Japanese mainland. And the Japanese, who at this point are essentially cut off, starving, and especially out of oil, decide to send Yamato what's left of their fleet, because at this point also both the B-29s have been bombing for a while, and more importantly for the Navy, Halsey, I believe he was the one in command at the time, was raiding the home islands with his carriers. And so most of their fleet is just gone at this point. You know, a lot of it's on the bottom of the harbors it's on the bottom of the inland sea, essentially. And they decide to send Yamato out on a suicide mission. And it was very explicitly this is a one-way trip. The idea was she was going to go out and beach herself near the invasion beaches and serve as like a fixed artillery battery there. Hope to destroy the invasion fleet that way. The problem, of course, is they had a battleship, a light cruiser, and a couple of destroyers, and they're sailing straight into the teeth of the largest fleet the world had ever seen. You know, the Americans had, I want to say, like 8 fast battleships, half a dozen slow battleships, a bunch of carriers. She went down under heavy air attack from, I want to say there were 200-300 sorties flown against her.
Gosh.
So.
But that's not really an argument against battleships then, because that's an argument against not using battleships in a thoroughly suicidal and stupid way against vastly superior forces, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
So let's sort of look at the poor old British, because they came up against the Japanese earlier on in the war at a time when the Japanese were having success, I guess, or right at the start, where it was the start of the battle for Singapore.
Yes.
And the British had 2 battleships, the Repulse and the Prince of Wales. So what was the fate of these 2 battleships?
They were also sunk by air attack. They had been dispatched, to back up slightly, British interwar planning was essentially based around having to fight a 2-front war against Germany and Japan, which they would have been able to do. It would have been tight, but they would have been able to do it. The problem came in 1940 when Italy joined the war.
Oh.
And suddenly, the need to keep fighting in the Mediterranean meant they couldn't send the fleet to the Far East they had been planning to. That just destroyed any chance of being able to shake loose the fleet that they had planned, especially when the French Navy had been planned The plan had sort of been that the French would neutralize the Italians, and now that was out the window, and they came fairly close to annoying the French into actually joining the Axis.
You mean the British fleet came close to doing that?
Well, I wouldn't describe it as the fleet so much as Churchill, to name the correct perpetrator there.
Do you want to say a bit more about that? Because that's quite intriguing to me.
Okay, yes, upcoming post, but sure. Basically, yeah, when the French fleet would have been fourth or fifth on the world navy, on the list of world navies in 1940. So when they collapsed, there was the concern that the ships were going to end up in Axis hands, which would have been really, I mean, it was disastrous enough when France left the war and left the British facing Germany and Italy. But now to have them facing Germany and Italy and France was really, really, would have been even worse. Now, the French weren't going to let this happen. They had done everything they could to make this clear to the British. No, we're not going to surrender the ships. We will sink them first. And to their credit, they eventually did. In 1942, when the Germans tried to take over the ships, they scuttled everything. But Churchill wasn't willing to give them that much credit. And, I mean, and in fairness, the Germans were on the Channel. There was fear about invasion daily, and London is being, and the Germans are coming over and bombing. So yeah, they're under, there is a lot of pressure here. So what he did is he first ordered that all the French ships that had fled to British ports when the Germans, took over France were to not be allowed to leave. And then he ordered that the ships, most of the fleet, the biggest concentration of fleet was in Mers el Khabur, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which is near Iran and Algeria.
Mm-hmm.
And he sent a force. It was Hood, Valiant, and Repulse, I think. No, not Repulse. Resolution? 3 battleships, a carrier, and some other ships, to go and basically tell the French commander, okay, you have 3 options. You can either join us, go to America, go intern yourself on the other side of the Atlantic, or we're going to start shooting. And the French said, we're not going to join you, because as far as they were concerned, the legitimate government was in Vichy, and had said, the legitimate government's in Vichy. We're not going to just decide to go off and have a war on our own. We're not going to go and turn ourselves in America. No. Okay, start shooting. And so they did. And they managed to destroy one older French battleship, damage another one, and a modern-ish battleship. But the last of the battleships there got away, got to sea, made it to Toulon, along with a bunch of other ships. So it didn't actually take them all out, and it's kind of amazing that the French didn't just, the Vichy government didn't just go, right, fine, you want to have a war, we'll have a war.
That's very interesting to me, because the way I remember that story, which of course is wrong, is that the British did actually sink the French fleet, and so this is news to me, I guess, that it was only a partial sinking of the fleet and maybe not even, the greater part.
Okay, I mean, they did manage to put a reasonable fraction of it out of action. But there was a fair bit of spin by Churchill to justify it, essentially. And so that got picked up by a bunch of later sources, which,
Well, I remember Churchill said something to the effect that history will remember him kindly because he would write the history. And he was actually a very capable writer of history books. So maybe there's something in that. His ability to tell the story may have some relevance there.
There is, I think, definitely a lot of truth to that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think it was Alan Brooke who said something along the lines of, with Churchill in charge, we're always on the edge of disaster. And this is the guy whose basic job was to sit on Churchill's crazier schemes. He was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, and say, no, this is a stupid plan, we're not going to do it. With Churchill, we're always on the edge of disaster. Without Churchill, it would just be disaster. And it's like, yeah, that is accurate.
I guess one of his greatest talents was to know when he had to defer to somebody who knew better than him, to know when he had to rein it in eventually. When push came to shove, he would defer to Burke.
I suppose he learned that in the interwar years.
Yes, or indeed even perhaps in the First World War.
Well, that was actually what I was thinking of, Gallipoli and all. But
yes.
No, that's a rabbit hole we don't need to go down.
No, indeed. We've been down quite a few rabbit holes already, but let's head off down the planned rabbit hole, which we were going to talk a little bit about Repulse and Prince of Wales.
Yes. coming back to that. So the problem was 1941. Japan is obviously getting restless because they've been fighting in China for 4 years now, and no, I'm not going to go into that. Can, but I'm not going to. Uh,
Feel free.
working on a series on that actually too.
Okay, okay. So I don't want you. You know, you can give some trailers, but I don't want you to. I don't want you to spoil anything.
Japan and China. Well, it's not so much that as just still in the process on that one.
Okay.
Japan, invaded China in 1937. A lot of resource hungry. America's getting annoyed with them over this and starting to cut off their access to supplies, specifically oil. So there's a decent chance Japan's going to move. And the British normally would have sent half the fleet or something. Instead, they're stuck with sending 2 ships. I think there were originally plans to send a carrier with them, but whichever carrier it was ran aground and couldn't make it in time, which to some extent is probably a good thing. So they arrive in Singapore, I want to say like a week before before the war kicks off. I actually went to Singapore a couple of years ago, and it was really interesting, although my favorite memory was the time they described the war as starting on December 8th, and I just burst out laughing because, as an American, December 7th is so ingrained in my head.
Sorry, I don't understand. Why is December 7th?
It's the dateline. That is just seared into the national conscience, thanks to FDR, who put it there. But so they sorted to try to oppose the Japanese landing in northern Malaya, and the Malaya campaign is just a mess. The British did not. The Royal Navy probably made the best showing, and it got both of its battleships sunk. So that shows you the kind of bar you're looking at here.
Yeah.
But they sorted to try to oppose the landing in what is now, I guess it'd now be kind of northern Malaysia, was actually kind of on the Malaysia-Thailand border. Got called back because the Air Force is just a mess. The Japanese just trashed them. And there was no air cover and ships, a lot of chaos going on. And eventually they got spotted by the Japanese, and the Japanese launched a couple squadrons of, I want to say it was about 72 level and torpedo bombers, and these are land-based twin-engine G3M Bettys and Nells, whatever the Japanese designation is. Those are the Allied reporting names.
So, sorry, just to interrupt, they're coming from land. They're not coming from carriers.
Yes. The carriers were all off Hawaii, or on their way back from Hawaii.
Right.
So yeah, no carriers. And part of it was the British had no idea these planes had these capabilities. The Japanese basically built their airplanes out of toilet paper. Like, they were just so flimsy, but this meant they had incredible range.
Right.
Which was great at the start of the war when the Allies didn't really know what they were doing. Because the problem was all the good British pilots are in Europe, and all the good British planes are in Europe, and the Americans hadn't quite got it yet. So it works great up to a point, and then when we, the Allies, figure out how to fight them, it suddenly stops working, and they just start dying. Anyway, so part of it was they were like, there's no way we're going to come under attack here from, they're off sort of, they're, 100, 200 miles north of Singapore. There's like no bases in what they thought was the range. Of course, turns out they're wrong about that. And there were other issues. And again, they had been fighting for 3 years by this point. And, they'd learned a lot about anti-aircraft artillery in the, anti-aircraft fire in the Mediterranean. Turns out the Italians are not as good as the Japanese. And the Japanese at this point are probably the best in the world at naval aviation. Their pilots were incredible. The problem was, of course, that they had no pipeline to replace them when the war started. And so, these are people who've been trained for, who've been doing this for 5 or 6 years now. And when the war starts, you can't take 5 or 6 years to train a replacement. That guy's dead, he's dead.
But just to understand, you say they're the best in the world. Is that because they've been training, or have they been fighting somebody?
They had a fair bit of operational experience in China.
Right.
Both the Air Force or the Army, both the Army and the Navy had been participating in that. So they'd been fighting in China, and they'd been training a lot. And the Japanese were, again, this is a country where the Constitution was written at the time so that the Army and Navy had control over, they had to approve the cabinet. Like, if they didn't like who the civilians wanted to put in charge of the government, they could just say, yeah, we're not going to appoint a Navy minister to your cabinet. And that cabinet couldn't go. They had to have a Navy minister, and the Navy could say, we don't like this cabinet, we're not going to send a Navy minister. And the Army could do the same thing.
So the Army and the Navy effectively, in a sense, control the civilian government?
Yes.
Huh.
The Japanese system worked reasonably well at the start when it was kind of, I would almost describe it as a system was kind of, to my impression, I'm not a historian of this stuff, was kind of based around a few pretty strong personalities and people who made it work. And the problem is those all died off in the teens and 20s and 30 and in, even into the early 30s.
Right.
And then you're just left with the system where there's no check on the military. And this is the same organization where, if an army commander goes and does, army commanders in China, especially when notorious, they would just ignore orders. Even the emperor at one point said, this was a few years earlier, don't invade the Soviet Union, Manchuria, Mongolia area. Don't invade the Soviets. Those are the orders. Guy goes and invades the Soviets anyway, no consequences. He gets away with it.
Yeah.
There were only consequences when they ran up against the Soviets the next year. That was 1938. They got away with it. In 1939, they didn't get away with it because the Soviets, Georgy Zhukov, he was now in charge and managed to just smash them. And okay, now we're going to purge, but that was what it took to get consequences for the higher commanders. And even then, some of the sort of mid-level officers responsible got away with it and went on to make plans in 1941. Speaking of those plans, Japanese show up. It was kind of lucky, I believe, that they managed to get there without running out of fuel, and attacked Prince of Wales with torpedoes, and managed to hit. One torpedo hit effectively doomed the ship because it was aft. It hit the King George V's there were some design flaws, particularly in the torpedo defense system, but the big issue was it bent one of the shafts while it was rotating, and that is extremely bad. That is just bad news, and there's really nothing you can do about it as a designer. But that opened up during a survey, of the wrecks fairly recently. They were able to send a diver all the way from outside to the engine room, up the hole ripped by the shaft rotating. Also knocked up most of the power because the RN did not have particularly strong standards for emergency electrical supply.
Right. Most
of the power's gone, and they've got major flooding, and they've lost I want to say it was 2 of the 4 shafts. So, ship is in a bad way. Repulse was handled very well. Her captain, Tennant, I believe, managed to avoid a surprising number of torpedoes before he finally got hit. But she went down, and Prince of Wales went down a little bit later after a couple more torpedo hits.
So, were they unlucky, or was it just a complete misunderstanding of the situation? Could they have had air cover? What's the judgment?
This was actually the one time they could have had air cover, and there was some confusion about no air cover over northern Malaya versus no air cover at all. And the air cover actually showed up just as the ships went down. The Tennant Repulse put out a call for air cover, and it actually showed up just as I think it was Prince of Wales sank.
Right.
But kind of the whole Malaya campaign is just one giant pile of what on earth were you guys thinking?
Yeah. It's not a subject I know a huge amount about, and I think it's just one of these things where I'd rather not know, because everything you do know is just so depressing. It's quite something.
That's a very reasonable position to take. Yeah.
Have you ever visited Japan?
I've flown through Japan. I have not visited, although I probably will. My wife's been twice before we got married and is going to drag me back there relatively soon.
Well, when you do go, and I know in your blog you have a sort of list of museums through the world, but if there's one that you visit, I would recommend above all else, and that's the one at the Yasukuni Jinja.
Ah, I have heard of that.
And that's the one where I guess it's funded by and run by sort of people who are effectively still preaching the nationalist cause. And the quality of the museum is absolutely first class. But when you read the account of the war and the account of the pre-war, it's giving you a story from an angle that you have never heard before, because it's almost entirely about, why Japan was justified in doing what it did. And, we've been, greatly misunderstood. It's extremely interesting to read because that's just something you don't hear. And it's great to get the point of view from the other side, because so often when you think about, the Japanese war, you think, what were they thinking? This was absolute madness, and what they were thinking is laid out pretty clearly in that particular museum.
I don't think thinking was high on the list of things they were doing in general. The whole bit about, for instance, let's invade the Soviets again. Our morale will make up for their firepower and numerical advantage. It didn't? Shocking. Well, this can't go wrong if we do it to the Americans, too.
It is quite extraordinary. And as a British person, for example, in the hallway to the museum, they have a locomotive that they've managed to reclaim from the Burma Railway,
Oh,
where all these Allied prisoners of war died, sort of
yeah.
building the railroad. And you can see pictures of it in the jungle, and there's sort of a little sign saying how happy they were to be able to recover this. And it really is one of the most, I don't want to say shocking, but it is so surprising, and it kind of knocks you back when you see it. But it is extremely interesting if you can just sort of dissociate yourself from it a little bit and just see it for what it is. And it's so different to what you see in the rest of Japan, which is very much more some terrible things happened in the war, and we hope it will never happen again, which you see at the atom bomb museums, for example. There's no militarism there or nationalism there whatsoever. It's very much focused towards peace, and altogether much more in line with the kind of thinking you would expect. But the Yasukuni Jinja is well worth a visit, albeit you might find yourself raising your eyebrows from time to time, if I can put it as gently as that.
I've actually been wanting to go there for a while. It sounds really interesting.
And the other thing occasionally you get is these buses that drive around various towns, and they're black buses with Japanese flags and there's loudspeakers blaring away. And what they're saying, I have no idea. And then I ask my Japanese friends, well, what are these buses? And they say, well, buses? We don't know what you're talking about. I say, look, they're these black buses. The loudspeakers say, no, we've never heard these. And it's almost they're just really don't like them and just don't want to talk about them because they're just a national embarrassment.
Yeah.
Anyway, strongly recommended. Okay, so we've done sort of how the battleships became redundant, but I think you said in your blog somewhere that actually the demise of the battleship was slightly exaggerated and that they continued to have a role at least for some decades after the Second World War. Is that fair enough?
I would place, if you had to say when was the battleship obsolete, like in terms of if I'm building a fleet from scratch to face another fleet, sort of ideal case. And in practical terms, they were kind of done after 1945, because at that point there were two navies, and it was the Americans and the British, and everybody else is a rounding error. There's just nobody who has another fleet to fight. So okay, at that point you kind of changes things. But if in a sort of ideal case, I would put the demise of the battleship at about mid to late 50s, because the problem is carriers are great. It's great to be able to sink your target a long way away. Wonderful. The problem is, what if you can't? And sinking battleships took an enormous amount of air power to do. We've discussed 4 out of the 5 battleships sunk at sea by air attack. It only happened 5 times.
Right.
Repulse and Prince of Wales each took about 3 dozen airplanes, which, to put it into perspective, is roughly the striking strength of a carrier. So, minimum a carrier. Yamato and Musashi each took like 4 or 5 carriers worth, possibly more. We're looking at a bunch of carriers for each battleship. The one left over is Roma, which was sunk by German-guided bombs in 1943. In that case, it was literally a dozen planes, but they were land-based bombers carrying a very experimental system that never worked that well again.
Unlucky.
Yeah, but at the same time, that was coming, and by the time they got all the bugs worked out in the mid-50s, okay, the number of airplanes you need to sink a battleship is going down. Even more important to that, nuclear weapons. And again, mid to late 50s, you're getting out of the realm, because in the early part of the 50s, they were extraordinarily expensive, very rare, and basically dedicated to strategic targets. And by the mid to late 50s, there were enough of those around, you could start looking at using them on tactical targets. Okay, we'll just drop a nuclear bomb on it, it'll go away. So you have improved airplanes, which make it possible to actually, a carrier can now potentially kill lots of battleships instead of maybe killing one. The other thing is, okay, what if the carrier just can't fly its planes? It's night. Weather's bad. You just can't fly planes then. One aspect there is carriers got more capable of that. Carrier-based aviation got more capable, more comfortable at night, more comfortable in bad weather. A lot of that was helped by better electronics, too. And the last thing is, okay, all of that fails. You need something to stop the other side's battleship. And that is ultimately what battleship as carrier escort, why it would be important in a fleet is, okay, last ditch attempt, it's been stormy for 3 days and their surface force has caught up to us. How do we handle that? And that eventually became obsolete in the late 50s when nuclear-tipped surface-to-air missiles came into use. Because those also had an anti-ship rule. So now you have something that you can fire from your escorts you're going to have anyway for anti-air use at an attacking surface unit. Okay, now the battleship's obsolete. There's just no real case where it offers the capability to match its cost.
And they are expensive beasts, right?
They are very expensive to run. Pretty much why they're gone now. I mean, it's not to say you couldn't find uses for them after that. USS New Jersey was reactivated to go to Vietnam. Bombardment platform did very well there. Did so well that the North Vietnamese really didn't like her, and thus the U.S. said, okay, you don't like that, we'll stop doing it. You wonder why the Vietnam War went the way it did? That is it. Because anytime we did something they didn't like, they'd complain and we'd stop doing it. But that's another whole mess of things to not go into right now. And then in the 80s, all 4 Iowas were reactivated as essentially it was, in my view, and this is definitely a minority view, other people will tell you it was to fight the Kirovs, which doesn't really make sense.
So the Kirovs are a Russian battleship, are they, or Russian ship?
Not exactly a battleship. Should probably define my terms better here. Battleship being primarily gun-armed, large armored. The Kirovs were often referred to as battle cruisers. I don't agree with that for complicated reasons, but it gives sort of an idea. They're definitely bigger and heavier than any cruisers. They're by far the largest surface combat ships built since the end of the Second World War. Primarily missile-armed, both for anti-air and anti-surface use. The problem is heavy anti-air, if we can get the Iowa within gun range of a Kirov, the Iowa's going to win. But if we can't do that, it just isn't going to work that well.
And the cost of building and maintaining through long ages is just prohibitive eventually. Or at least it's not prohibitive exactly, but you can do it just as well or nearly as well with something else, which is so much less expensive.
Yeah. Which, to back up a little bit, so my view on the reason they were brought back is essentially gave them extra, some of it was they were intended to carry Tomahawks, which had nuclear warheads, so you're adding nuclear strike platforms pretty cheaply, which is going to mess with the Soviet plans. And it's just extra capital ships, extra ships that are more important than just your typical, one of the big advantages of naval power is its diplomatic punch. If you were just building a navy for the hottest of wars, you just have SSBNs. That's it. And so as a ship that you can send to, show the flag in Latin America, say.
Right.
Battleships are great. They're cheap. They're extremely charismatic.
Sorry, you say a battleship is cheap?
Well, okay. In terms of if you're Ronald Reagan in 1980 and you need more capital ships, you want to engage more with Latin America, you want to send warships on port visits, and you don't want to just send destroyers. Well, we've only got, I think, 15 carriers. We could tie one of those up, or we could reactivate a battleship for the cost of, the cost of getting a battleship is the same as the cost of getting a destroyer.
Right.
And the battleship's cheaper to run than a carrier.
Right.
It's less useful in a carrier, but it's cheaper. So, in the context of a sort of shortish period, we're going to try to, Reagan's strategy was, we're going to try to run the Soviets out of money, go.
Yeah.
So he's not looking at doing this forever. He's looking at doing this for 10 years or so, which is about how long it took. Something that costs what a destroyer does and is cheaper to run than a carrier and is really good at showing the flag is actually a pretty good deal. But you wouldn't do it without having the ship sitting there to the background of the ship sitting there to work from.
Yeah, you wouldn't build one from scratch.
No, and you wouldn't bring them back today because they're much further out of service and we kind of don't need the same. We'd be better served just building more carriers at the moment.
You mentioned at the end of World War II, there's really only two navies. There's the American Navy and there's the British Navy, which is going to, I think it's pretty obvious to everybody, go into a pretty fast decline. I think that was obvious even then.
Yes.
So who is the U.S. Navy primarily organized to confront at this stage?
That was a big question. And it was tied into the immediate post-war austerity because the American people had just spent a bunch of money on a war and they didn't really, they weren't convinced that the communists were actually a threat yet. And they also went, we have the bomb. We're buying a bunch of these shiny new bombers. Do we really need a Navy? And there was a period in 1949 and 1950 when it looked like the answer to that was possibly no. The Navy had plans to build a carrier-based nuclear strike force. And they had gotten the first ship approved. It was called the USS United States. They laid the keel, and then like a week later, it was canceled by the Secretary of Defense. Without congressional approval, against the advice of the Secretary of the Navy, etc. And so at this point, the Navy starts to get really annoyed about this because they're looking at serious cuts because all of the money is going to the Air Force. And Congress held a set of hearings, and the Navy made a pretty good case, and there's a tremendous amount of political infighting going on in all of this. The Navy managed to make its case well enough. They were basically able to stall the cuts long enough for the Korean War to break out. And then they discover, okay, maybe nuclear bombs are not going to solve everything, and carriers are really, really useful in this kind of context because they're very mobile. You know, at the time, we had some forces in Japan, but it wasn't that much. And if we wanted to get more air power to the field rapidly, well, turns out carriers are really good at that. And weirdly, I think we just ended up on our on the topic we were trying to get to from the start.
Yes, we finally got there. Well, you know, there's no point in rushing straight to the main dish, right? You have to have a few starters.
No, it wasn't that. I just hadn't realized that this particular line would end up there.
Okay, so our main topic was, have carriers now become redundant?
And my answer to that is basically tied into the comments on the Iowas as capital ships and to carriers in the post-World War II world. No, they haven't, because you don't just buy a Navy for hot wars. I mean, it's certainly not something you want to exclude, but these are tremendously versatile. A Navy is a tremendously versatile thing. Unlike, especially, a fleet of nuclear-armed bombers, which has two options, on and off, to a first approximation at least. Navies are great for, hey, this person's doing something we don't like, we're going to park a carrier off their coast.
Yeah.
And if it's, frankly, anybody other than China, that's a really, I mean, I sort of go back and forth on how China would fare, how the carriers would fare against China, but against, say, Iran or North Korea or, I don't know, whoever else decides to make trouble. You know, if Britain starts making trouble for us.
We won't, we promise.
No, I know. Not that I think it's likely at all. That would be an interesting.
We learned our lesson back in 1776. We're not going to do this again.
Well, you guys more or less won the naval. Well,
you were talking about 1812, which was it was quite interesting. You had bigger boats than us. It was extremely unfair, but
yes. I had such conflicted feelings when I was reading the Patrick O'Brian novel that covered America versus Britain at the War of 1812, because I'm like, I like the British characters, but they're fighting Constitution, and no, I have to root for the Americans.
Well, it was 3-1. It was 3-1 to the Americans, as I recall.
Yes, and then our ships spent the rest of the war hiding in ports because you stopped operating frigates independently. Yes, tactically we won, but strategically it wasn't quite so clear. Well, actually, strategically, you guys won that one. But, you know, back to carriers, though. These are... You have a Air Force on each ship that is equivalent to... I don't know exactly where it would fall in the World Air Force table, but it's pretty high up there. And you can park it anywhere there's water, which is, you know, pretty much anywhere. It's self-supporting. You don't need agreements with the locals to get bases and access rights and stuff. You can just say, no, I want you over there, go there. And being able to do that is tremendously valuable in the, 99% of the time that we're not in a hot war with somebody. And again, hot war being essentially us fighting China.
Yeah.
Anything below that, a carrier is a tremendously valuable thing. And again, if you're only focusing on what do we do if we get into a hot war with China, well, you build SSBNs, and we're doing that. But
somebody said when I ask a question which is potentially extremely stupid, and this is potentially extremely stupid, you said, don't say what are SSBNs, say for our listeners, what are SSBNs? But I think I vaguely remember, which is that they're submarines, right?
Ballistic missile submarines. Sorry, that's my bad. I think in acronyms. Yeah, that's a ballistic missile submarine, specifically a nuclear powered one, but nobody's built conventional ballistic missile submarines since the 60s.
Let's just wind back from that a little bit. If you're in a hot war with China, the only time you're likely to be in a hot war with China is if you're trying to defend Taiwan, right? I mean, if that was ever to happen.
Most likely.
I mean, personally, I believe the Americans, if push came to shove, would not try to defend Taiwan. But who knows? That's the only time that I can imagine there being a shooting war between China and America. At least it's the most likely scenario. So I guess I have two questions from that. In that situation, would the carriers be useful in trying to defend Taiwan? And can Taiwan resist an amphibious invasion from China? And maybe amphibious invasions from China are not something that you've given a lot of thought to, but I'd be interested in any thoughts you have.
I don't know. I've done some reading on the Chinese recently. I honestly think their fleet is widely underrated. I think they've got a very good navy, but the way they're building it definitely doesn't look like it's not the sort of fleet I would expect them to build if they were planning on getting into a hot war with the US, if that makes sense.
Well, sort of. I mean, maybe just say why you think that.
Well, basically they're building for the sort of power projection, not hot war operations that, the same reason we build carriers. I mean, they're building carriers. Their fleet is looking like the sort of thing you would build if you wanted to do broad power projection operations. Carriers, large, air defense destroyers, heavy amphibious forces. Not the sort of thing you would do to cross 100 miles of the Straits of or the Formosa Straits, but the sort of thing you would build if you wanted to, say, be able to put a battalion of Marines ashore somewhere in Africa where the locals are doing something you don't like.
Right.
And the Chinese have a bunch of interests in the, Africa, Asia, sort of outside of the Americas. The Chinese have a ton of investment and interest. They have a bunch of investment, they have a bunch of interest there. And so they're kind of, to my eyes, building their navy to be able to support those interests, to go in, and they've done things like humanitarian aid and evacuating citizens from places where they're suddenly shooting. They did that in Libya, they did that in Yemen. And that's long been the sort of thing that the Royal Navy and the USN and the French Navy have been doing, and that kind of nobody else can do until now.
But just to come back to the carriers for a minute, if there was to be a war over Taiwan, is the fact that the carriers are then tied to one location, which is to say they're tied to Taiwan, to some extent they have to be within range of the aircraft, presumably, to be of any use to Taiwan. Does this make a difference in whether they will survive a conflict?
I am, at this point, genuinely unsure as to how the carriers would fare in a war with China. China, has put a fair bit of investment into anti-carrier sort of defensive systems. The bulk of their effort has been in the broader power projection stuff, but they've apparently got a quite effective sea surveillance system. They've got the anti-ship ballistic missiles, probably. I'm not actually sure how well those work. But, they've got an extensive land-based air force. They are preparing for that. At the same time, the carriers wouldn't necessarily have to be within range of Taiwan. The Chinese are not going to be okay with carriers just randomly attacking their homeland. They're going to have to guard against that. So even the threat of carriers operating against the Chinese coast could tie down a lot of forces that could otherwise be deployed against Taiwan. And again, mobility is kind of key here. Any fixed base within range of China is potentially at risk from ballistic missile attack. Not necessarily nuclear tip, just they've got a bunch of ballistic missiles with explosive warheads. It's going to make a mess of, Guam and the Japanese bases and potentially the Korean bases. Carrier is a lot harder to kill with a ballistic missile because it can move.
Right. But I guess my feeling is, I feel that any conflict with China over Taiwan would be a bit like what you were describing for Vietnam, which is to say it would be played according to some kind of rules, which might not be sensible in the case of an all-out total war, but make some kind of sense if the parties are trying to keep it under some kind of control, but you've still got yourself into a shooting war, which I guess is what you were describing in the case of Vietnam. So you might say legitimate targets are anything that's going on in the Formosa Strait, but outside of that, we do not want to spread the war. Otherwise, it's in a terrible situation and you're in a full-scale nuclear war before you can say, too much about it.
I suppose that's feasible, but Vietnam was particularly weird and was sort of enabled by a particularly weird set of ideas that were in Washington at the time. The Soviet/Chinese/North Vietnamese attitude seems to have been, if you guys want to handicap yourselves like that, okay, cool, I guess. It wasn't particularly mutually agreed. The reason that the carriers and the bases in Thailand didn't come under heavy attack, some of it was lack of ability, and the only people who could have attacked those were the Chinese and especially the Soviets, who weren't formally participating in the war.
But I thought in your latest blog, you were quite bullish about the ability of the carriers to survive. And I guess one question I had was, I was thinking about it in the context of your pieces on the Falklands. And of course, the British Navy has to make do with a much lower budget. And, that was all, must be about 40 years ago now.
Yeah.
And of course, the technology has moved on. But the one thing that really struck me reading your piece on the Falklands was how often the British missile defense systems, just basically, as soon as you push the button, they said, sorry, we're going to go to sleep now. And I wonder how reliable is the defense technology that they now have against a pretty determined missile attack, for example.
And this is part of the reason I'm less bullish than I used to be. I'm still quite confident in, the carrier's not useless. It's against sort of anybody but China. I still think it's extremely survivable. Against China, I honestly don't know. I don't think anybody really knows. The U.S. military has its best guesses. China has its best guesses. I'm not privy to those, and if I was, I definitely wouldn't be able to say. And it's kind of going to depend on so much of war these days depends on, complicated electronic systems that make no sense if you from the outside and such. And it's kind of going to depend on whose systems work better, Maybe the U.S. has some cyber attack waiting to go and cripple China's sea surveillance system, and then suddenly the carriers are quite survivable. That could very well happen. And I'm sure there's people on the U.S. side who are working very hard to build that attack, and I'm sure there's people on the Chinese side working very hard to thwart it. And the whole war could hang on who manages to win that battle. We sitting out here, we can't know that.
That makes perfect sense. Personally, I think the whole war will depend, whether there is a war and how it turns out will probably depend on the Taiwanese themselves and how badly they want to remain independent from China. And that's not, to me at least, that's not particularly clear right now.
Yeah, how badly the Chinese want to actually risk a shooting war to bring Taiwan into the fold.
Yeah.
To some extent, I think that's probably the bigger driver there. And officially they say they want to, but nuclear weapons have a way of, the potential of nuclear weapons have a way of dousing those kind of ambitions.
So you think it would have to be a deal done between the Americans and the Chinese behind closed doors before they were willing to take that kind of a chance, perhaps?
Not necessarily, but they'd have to be a lot more confident, I think, than they can be now to be willing to risk it. It could be that they managed to diplomatically just, move it so that the U.S. isn't likely to go after Taiwan. And frankly, if they'd probably build the plan so that if the U.S. starts sending credible, back off, we're not going to let you do this signals, they'd probably fold. I guess they'd fold.
Well, maybe one day we'll find out. So just to sort of finish off, I was interested in your piece on the Falklands, particularly the Argentine Air Force. Not that they were necessarily particularly successful, but my goodness me, they were courageous.
Very much so, yes. It is a fascinating conflict, just because it's the only time we've seen a proper air/sea battle between modern militaries that was even vaguely symmetrical. Incredible courage, sadly in this, in the sense of recognizing that courage let down by bad fusing. Very fortunate for the British.
Yes, if all the Argentine bombs that had hit the ships would have gone off, I guess the battle may well have ended rather differently.
Very likely, yes. Because I think there was Glasgow that got hit. There was
Just the sheer scale of the losses coming in on the British side would perhaps have changed public opinion. I don't know. But also the Argentinians, they they maybe weren't the shrewdest in their choice of targets.
very, very much so. The use of the exocets was particularly bad because it basically amounted to pop up about where you think the British are, run a radar scan. If you see something, launch at it. They had 5 missiles at the start of the war, and they managed to throw all five. In fairness, they did sink 2 ships. They sunk Sheffield with one, and that was basically a result of too much budget in. Well, okay, the British didn't know Exocet was coming at the time because they didn't think that the missiles were operational. And then secondly, it was just the Type 42s were really tight and didn't have the damage control margins built in that they probably should have. British procurement over the second half of the 20th century was often trying to find ways to spend less money than they really should have on things. So yeah, they just didn't have the margins to build in good damage control and like point defense systems and stuff. And then they sunk Atlantic Conveyor, which was important and strategically vital, but it was a container ship. It was not a carrier. It was not any kind of warship. And then the last one was just the missile missed, because the first 2 attacks were 2 missiles each. But yeah, this is the sort of weapon you should be trying to actually make sure hits the carrier instead of just flying into the sea.
Did they ever have a chance of sinking the carriers, do you think?
I don't think they ever had a particularly good shot. Part of it is the British were very, very cautious with the carriers. I mean, rightly so. Those were what was going to make the invasion possible. If they lose those, they lose. And so they were quite careful about making sure that they were far enough out at sea, because this whole battle stigma is on the very edge of where the Argentine Air Force can get to. I think in a lot of cases it was like we have like 2 minutes. They had like 5 minutes of combat time over the zone. They just. And so, if you keep the carriers another couple hundred miles east, there's just no way to get the planes out there and have any time to search, which, again, ships move, makes them hard to hit.
And I think your point that you make in your blog is that the sea is a surprisingly big place.
Yes, the sea is surprisingly big, and even with the best modern technology, finding a moving ship and hitting it is pretty difficult. And they didn't have the systems we have today to do that. Argentina did not have available. There were a lot of organizations on the Argentinian side that did do very well. A particular one that springs to mind is VYCA-2, the air control unit at Stanley, which did really good work controlling Argentinian strikes, saying, okay, hey, the British have rumbled, you go home, and even trying to locate the carriers. British, of course, knew it was there and often would do deceptive things. Okay, your job is to take off, fly as low as you can for, 40 miles that way, and then come up like you're taking off. And there was at least one case where they sent out I think it was an Exocet strike, and it went for the 40 miles over their spot, and they just found empty ocean.
Nothing there at all. Yes, that spoke well of the British. I was very surprised to learn, and I should have known it maybe, but I was surprised to learn how much the airport at Stanley remained open and used by the Argentinians throughout the war. I had assumed that the British were able to interdict it, but actually it continued pretty much right up to the end, right?
Yeah, airports are hard things to shut down. Just, runways themselves, it's easy to repair. You push dirt in the crater and put a piece of steel matting over it.
But I was expecting the British to have been able to shoot down the transport planes, but it seems like we couldn't do that either.
Yeah, and some of that was the fact that you were extremely bottlenecked on anti-air platforms. And this was just kind of this is something that has changed since then. Because at the time, most of the ships had CCAT for anti-air, and this is a system that was literally designed as a replacement for like a twin Bofors on ships. That is what it was designed to do. So the missile itself was subsonic. And while that's fine in the 1950s, fine-ish, it's just not that effective by the 80s. I don't think they made a single hit during the whole war with those. So, the only ships that had a reasonable anti-air capability would have been the Type 42s, of which there were never more than about 3 in the whole area, and often, I think at one point they were down to a single ship. I guess technically Bristol, but she never came in the combat zone. Invincible, which also had Sea Dart, but carrier, you're not going to risk her inshore or anything. and the Type 22s, which again, there were only ever 2 or 3, and they were usually guarding something really important. So I think there were a couple times they tried to shoot down a transport with one of the Type 42s, but
they just pretty much let them run in. They weren't absolutely critical to the effort, I guess.
And Sea Dart had some issues.
All our missiles seem to have issues. When I was reading your piece, it was, they would lock on and then they would fall fast asleep almost instantly. It's quite astonishing. Yet the sidewinders off of the Harriers were terrific.
Well, and the sidewinders had been combat tested. And I think some of it is, these days, the amount of work that goes into making sure that a military system is actually combat ready, it is phenomenal. That's actually my day job, is helping do that sort of work. And I think probably the Falklands was pretty eye-opening for the British, and to a lesser extent the US, on terms of, this is harder than it looks. Because like the U.S. originally had very, very serious problems with its surface-to-air missiles, and that was only solved about 10 years after they were introduced. They actually canceled the follow-on program. It was one of the few things that Robert McNamara did maybe right. U.S. Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson. He canceled the follow-on program, and he said, no, we're going to spend the money on making the original missiles work. I am not a fan of his.
Well, he was the man who sort of controlled the Vietnam War, right?
Yes, among other things. I have many, many. That could be like 3 whole podcasts.
Oh dear. Poor old McNamara.
Yeah. So I think a lot of that, they presumably are putting a lot more work into that these days.
Making sure that what you've got actually works the way it's supposed to work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because like, again, the Sidewinders, part of it is the Sidewinder, amazing piece of missile technology, just in that they managed to build, the original Sidewinders were built in like the mid-50s out of, literally, let's take a 5-inch unguided rocket and strap a guidance system to it. How do you build a guidance system in the 50s that fits on a 5-inch rocket? It's incredible they managed it.
And were the British planes particularly good, or was it that the missile was so good that sort of flattered the plane?
I mean, you need both. Like the Harrier is a pretty, it's definitely an interesting airplane. The British quality of the personnel was always I would, among the major navies, I would say man for man, the Royal Navy is probably the best in the world today. Personnel quality on the British side was very good. The planes were, the Harrier is interesting because it's just so bizarre as a piece of aeronautic design, because the vertical takeoff and landing thing is kind of nuts. And the Sidewinder, it's not like it's really good in its sort of simplicity. It works. It was kind of just whoever has the system that fails the least is going to come out on top.
But were any of the British planes shot down by the Argentinian planes? I seem to remember not. I know that British did lose planes, but I think that was to possibly ground fire from the Falklands.
You did lose planes. There was some to ground fire. There was at least a couple to a mid-air collision, and I think 1 or 2 just to accidents. Operating airplanes at sea is tricky. It's hard to do. Yeah, I remember reading some of the British pilots commented that the Argentinians, in the brief interval when they did try air combat, because that only lasted like a day, they sent out some fighters, got trounced, and then just said, nope, we're not going to do this anymore. But they said they're making mistakes they tell you not to on day 2 of weapons school.
Right.
We learned not to do that on our second day in weapons school, the things that they're doing. So a lot of it was, they were very brave, and some of them were very good at delivering bombs, but ultimately it was a first-rank force versus a second-rank force in terms of skill and operational, ability to coordinate all the complicated things that go into to effectively applying military force.
Okay, well, shall we wind it up there? Because I think we've been going, it's been going for over an hour now. So thank you so much, Bean, for coming on. And I hope we might be able to come on again in the future, maybe when you have some more of your series completed, because it sounds like you have a fair bit in the works, right?
I always do. these things take a while to write, so I write about a month in advance.
How much time do you spend on your writing? Because it must, I mean, the quality is extremely high and the quantity is quite high. Do you ever think about putting it into book form, or are you happy to do it in blog form?
I have been, yes, although I haven't really done any work on that, but I've thought about it.
Okay, well, we'll see. Well, if you do, I'll definitely be one of the buyers. So anyway, thank you very much again. That was great fun.
Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.